A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus took Peter, James, and John, and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no fuller on earth could bleach them. Then Elijah appeared to them along with Moses, and they were conversing with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus in reply, "Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He hardly knew what to say, they were so terrified. Then a cloud came, casting a shadow over them. From the cloud came a voice, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." Suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone but Jesus alone with them. As they were coming down from the mountain, he charged them not to relate what they had seen to anyone, except when the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what rising from the dead meant. The Gospel of the Lord. Nowadays, we hear a lot in the news about places in the nation of Iraq. And sadly, a lot about what we hear is about terrorism and violence and persecution. But 100 years ago, places in that nation were in the news for a different reason. It's because they were being investigated as possible places where events in the Old Testament took place. And there was one investigator, an archaeologist named Charles Leonard Woolley, who more than any other person was responsible for those investigations. This man was born in London in 1880, and he was the son of an Anglican minister. And growing up, his father, the minister, told him stories from the Old Testament, and in particular from the book of Genesis. Now, today we hear from the 22nd chapter of Genesis about Abraham and Isaac. But the story that young Leonard remembered more than any other was from the 11th chapter of Genesis, about Abram before he changed his name, and his father Terah, and about how they went forth for the land of Canaan, and they left a place called Ur of the Chaldeans. And so, as his father was telling him this story, young Leonard was imagining what this city with this exotic name, Ur of the Chaldeans, that existed 4,000 years ago must have been like. And so then, when he was deciding what he wanted to do with his life, should I be a doctor, should I be a teacher, should I be a minister like my dad, he finally decided that his calling was to become an archaeologist so he could go unearth places from the ancient world, places like this Ur of the Chaldeans. And so he trained at Oxford University, and he graduated in 1905, and he was ready to go excavate. And he went abroad and he excavated some places in Syria and Egypt and the Sudan. And then after the First World War, he got his big chance. The British Museum wanted him to excavate an area outside of the Iraqi city of Nasiriyah, because 4,000 years ago, this was part of the Sumerian Empire. And there was a legend about a lost city of Ur that was located somewhere in this region. And a while back, some bricks had been found with some strange inscriptions on them outside of Nasiriyah. And so in 1922, Woolley went to Nasiriyah, and he went about 10 miles southwest to this location, and he saw the outline of what's called a ziggurat, which is an ancient temple complex, and he started excavating. And he came upon some ruins that were estimated to be from about the 7th century BC, and as often happens at a site like this, when you excavate a layer, then you go down deeper and you come to another layer of ruins, of relics from an earlier time. And so he kept going down deeper, and he finally got to a level that he assessed was probably from the time of Abraham, about 2,000 years before the time of Christ. And he started to excavate this magnificent city. There was enough housing there for about 25,000 people. And there were just great shrines and statues and inscriptions and a fancy royal cemetery. And as he's excavating, he's thinking back to his childhood, and he's thinking to himself, am I excavating Ur of the Chaldeans? Is the place where I am standing and the place where the Bible tells us about, are they one and the same? And there was little doubt that he had indeed found the lost city of Ur. There were no other cities that the legends told of in that area. But was this Ur of the Chaldeans? And finally he decided, well, yes, of course it is. What else could it be? And in 1929 he wrote a book and he published it, and it was entitled Ur of the Chaldees, to make this link with this place he had found with the Scripture. Well, other people weren't quite so sure. They pointed out a few things. First, there weren't any Chaldeans in the Sumerian region at the time of Abraham. They didn't get there till about 1,300 years later. And secondly, if you read the Scripture, it tells about Terah and Abram going forth for the land of Canaan, but they stopped at a place called Haran, and they stayed there for about 60 years. Now, you don't need a shovel to find Haran. It's still in the same place it's been for thousands of years, and it's still there today. It's in the southern part of Turkey. And if you looked at maps of ancient routes back then, you would see that Terah and Abram would have had to go quite a bit out of their way to get to Haran on their way to Canaan. So that didn't make sense. And finally, the names of the characters in the Scripture, Terah and Nahor and Haran, they weren't Sumerian names. They were names that were more characteristic of northern Mesopotamia. So if the Sumerian city, the lost city of Ur, wasn't Ur of the Chaldeans, then what else could be Ur of the Chaldeans? Well, as it turns out, there's a city in the southern part of Turkey, about 25 miles north of Haran, and the city is named Urfa. And it's been there for thousands of years, and there's almost 1 million people living there today. And there may have been Chaldean people living there at the time of Abraham. And so if you ask, well, who thinks that Urfa is Ur of the Chaldeans? Well, the people of Urfa do, because they've made it into a big tourist attraction. They've identified a cave where they take tourists to show them, and they say, this is the cave where Abraham was born. And there's a big pool of water in the city called Abraham's Pool, and there's a legend associated with it. So today, if you ask the question, where is Ur of the Chaldeans that we hear about in the Bible, the answer is we just don't know. It could be the lost city of Ur down in Samaria, or it could be Urfa, or it could be somewhere else. We're just not certain. And so today, as we hear our gospel and we hear about Jesus leading the apostles, Peter and James and John, up the high mountain, we can tell ourselves that those apostles may have had that same uncertainty in their minds, that they knew the Scriptures and the prophets foretold of this great Messiah who would one day come among them to save them. And then they saw before them at this time, at this place, walking among them, this Jesus of Nazareth who spoke with authority and did great deeds. And they were wondering, is this Jesus of Nazareth and the Messiah that the Scriptures told us of, are they one and the same? And while we may never know the location of Ur the Chaldeans, God wasn't going to let this remain uncertain. And so we hear about Jesus' garments becoming a brilliant white, and then he was speaking with the great figures from the Old Testament, Moses and Elijah, and then we hear the voice of God coming from a cloud. This is my beloved Son, listen to him. As if to say, on this, let there be no doubt. Jesus of Nazareth, the man among you, and Emmanuel, God with us, they are one and the same. And today, as we look at the nation of Iraq and, of course, Syria and Ukraine and everywhere else, and we see all the troubles of our world, we tell the world, look to Jesus Christ for hope. But the world can see Jesus Christ in two ways. They can see the divine person of God, the all-powerful, who exists beyond time and space, who we can see only through faith. And then they can see the Jesus of Nazareth, who walked in the first century Palestine, and we can even go over there and pretty much walk in his footsteps, who we know through the annals of history. And the world sees two separate individuals. But we can turn to today's gospel, and we can hear God telling us with no uncertainty, the Christ of faith and the Christ of history, they are one and the same. The person of God has come among us to live with us and to lead us to our salvation. And as the great archaeologist Charles Leonard Woolley could remind us, as we go forth in search for hope, we don't need to dig any deeper than that.